And yet in practice, those very ideals that are being prized so highly are being employed by Napoleon and the pigs to make the animals less free by making them instead submit to a symbol that's meant to stand in for freedom rather than the thing itself. Stanley points out that the connotations of a word or a phrase, when it's used, enter the sort of background assumptions of a conversation, pretty much regardless of what someone is trying to say. A big part of Napoleon's propaganda revolves around Snowball, who is another pig that organised the initial revolution with him and who Napoleon ousted in a coup. From this point on, Snowball is said to be behind everything that goes wrong with Animal Farm. Napoleon will sniff around somewhere and claim that Snowball had definitely been there. And even if another animal stood up to deny this, they would still be accepting the implicit framing of Snowball as this quasi-Satan figure of Animal Farm. Snowball has become a scapegoat, and just like many of the scapegoats in our own world, he becomes so tangled up with his extreme negative connotations that his position as scapegoat becomes almost impossible to challenge. This is another aspect of propaganda that translates very easily to online discourse. It's kind of cliche at this point to point out that it is difficult to have conversations online, and answering why is a complicated issue that I can't possibly do justice here. But I do think that at least part of the explanation is that we are absolutely flooded with these highly loaded terms, and they are generated online at frankly dizzying speeds. Even take something as kind of relatively tame and benign as debates online over religion. We have a plethora of connotations associated with the key terms of religious debate that can really get in the way of rational and reasonable deliberation if we're not careful. Think about how the term atheist has occasionally been associated with a particular irritating, condescending figure, or how the word evangelical often brings to mind a fundamentalist American pastor, even though that makes up a very small minority of evangelicals. The internet has even homegrown some loaded terms, like Reddit atheist, or more recently, orthobro. I'm not saying these terms are never useful. It's good to call a spade sometimes. But their overuse and their inappropriate use can dissolve potentially helpful exchanges into outright hostility. And within these ideological camps, these terms can also be used as a kind of in-group propaganda that further disrupts mutual understanding. And as I said, this is a relatively gentle example compared to the frequency and severity of loaded terms in other corners of the internet. Think about how political discourse occurs online. It would be easier to count the number of key terms in those discussions that aren't loaded with connotations to the point that they're borderline unhelpful. And again, I want to be absolutely clear. It's not that emotional or non-rational connotations of words are always bad or always unhelpful. As I said, they're a big part of what facilitates the diversity of conversations we can have.
Sao lại không thích bài phím tiếng Nhật? Bài phím tiếng Nhật đẹp mà.
Discourse that it interferes with rational and reasonable discussions. In other words, when rather than looking at the contents of the propositions at play, we instead are taken up by the connotations. And finally, one of Stanley's most interesting observations about the language of propaganda is that the terms that are most damaging, or most potentially damaging, might not necessarily be the ones that we already recognize as unhelpfully loaded, things like racial epithets or outright insults. They may instead be terms that we think of as straightforwardly descriptive, that do carry epistemically distorting associations, but we don't realize that for whatever reason. Let's use, again, a relatively tame but still political example. Take the term benefits in my own country, the United Kingdom. In the 2000s and early 2010s, the term came to be associated with relatively impoverished people trying to game the system and get away with not having to work. And undoubtedly, this was true for a minority of benefits payments. However, because the term became so closely associated with this group of people, it almost turned benefits into a dirty word. And this meant that even those people who had honestly just fallen on hard times and struggled to find a job, or those on benefits because they'd had an accident that they weren't able to work, or those receiving them because they were caring for a sick family member, were tainted by their association with this loaded word. And for a long time, this just made the topic of discussing social safety nets in the UK incredibly difficult, because so many of the conversations would be swimming in a whole host of unspoken assumptions as to the type of person claiming this money. And because they were unspoken, it was very difficult to challenge. All of this is to say,
敵を徹底的に叩き潰すまで全力で戦うぞ。はい。
力がみなぎる。
はい。油断する。
弱い。サイは投げられたってな。じゃあ行くとするか。弱い。力がみなぎる。
はい。世の前にひざまずけ。はい。
Individual psychological curatives to employ. There are a few things that we can learn from this test. The first is that propagandistic sets of beliefs are likely to use things like group membership to keep us in them, and this provides a very strong non-rational reason for staying. We looked at that a little bit earlier. The second is that combating propaganda isn't something that we can really do alone, and also that propagandistic beliefs is only something that we can do in a disappointingly piecemeal fashion. I've mentioned this on the channel before, but one of the great epistemologists from